Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video explores historical journalism and social trends regarding the legal evolution of divorce in the United States. The information provided is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Marriage laws and judicial precedents vary significantly by jurisdiction and have changed drastically over time. You should not rely on this historical overview for current legal matters. Always consult with a qualified attorney or licensed professional regarding your specific situation, and conduct your own due diligence before making any life-altering decisions. Imagine it is 1850. You are a man of standing in a growing American city, but your domestic life has become an unbearable cage of resentment. You walk to the local newsstand, pick up the Daily Gazette, and search for a way out. What you find isn't a list of family law firms, but a public shaming column where men are forced to post notices of bed and board separations, publicly stripping their wives of credit to protect their own estates. But here is the shock. While you might think the 19th century was a bastion of patriarchal control where men walked away with everything, the historical archives of U.S. journalism reveal a much more complex and often more devastating reality. For over a century, the American press didn't just report on divorce. It served as a weapon, a courtroom, and a public executioner of a man's reputation. We are embarking on a deep dive into the archives of the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and small-town journals from the 1800s through the mid-20th century. We are uncovering a forgotten era where fault-based divorce meant a man's private failures were printed in ink for his neighbors, employers, and creditors to read over breakfast. We are going to look at the alimony panic of the 1920s, the rise of the divorce mills in Reno, and how the media's portrayal of the disposable husband actually shaped the very laws that govern family courts today. If you have ever wondered why the modern system feels the way it does, you have to see where it started. By the end of this series, you will understand the historical DNA of the American divorce process, giving you a perspective on the social and legal landscape that most people completely ignore. To understand the modern American male's experience in the legal system, we have to travel back to the mid-19th century, a time when divorce was not a dissolution of a contract, but a moral trial. In the 1850s and 60s, journalism was the primary enforcer of social norms. When a man sought a divorce or was sued for one, it was front-page news. The concept of no-fault divorce didn't exist. To get a decree, someone had to be the villain. Historical trends in journalism show that the guilty party was often framed in visceral, evocative language designed to sell papers. In the mid-1800s, journalists focused heavily on the notice of non-responsibility. This was a specific type of advertisement men would take out in newspapers. You see, under the legal doctrine of coverture, a husband was legally responsible for his wife's debts. If a marriage was failing, the husband's first move was often to publish a notice stating, "My wife, Sarah, has left my bed and board without just cause, and I will no longer be responsible for any debts she incurs." This was the 19th century version of freezing the credit cards. However, the media didn't just print the notice. They often followed up with investigative scandal sheets that questioned the man's character. Did he drive her away? Was he a provider or a tyrant? The public was the jury long before the judge weighed in. As we move into the Gilded Age of the late 1800s, the tone of journalism shifted from moral condemnation to sensationalism. This was the era of the high society divorce. Case studies from the 1880s show that if a man of wealth was involved in a divorce, the newspapers would detail every piece of evidence. This was the birth of the yellow journalism era, where the Hearst and Pulitzer papers realized that domestic strife sold more copies than political reform. For a man in this period, a divorce meant his alienation of affection, or his infidelity, was transcribed in shorthand by reporters sitting in the front row of the courtroom. The historical record shows that these reports often focused on the financial ruin of the man, portraying the loss of property and status as a justified punishment for his failure to maintain a Christian household. The turn of the century brought about a fascinating and terrifying period for men known in journalism as the alimony era. By the 1910s and 20s, as women began to gain more social agency, the media started focusing on the alimony jail. Yes, historical archives from the New York Daily News and other tabloids are filled with stories of men who were sent to prison simply because they could not meet the skyrocketing alimony payments demanded by the courts. These men were often referred to as alimony slaves. Journalism in this era began to show a split. On one hand, papers championed the protection of women, But on the other, they couldn't ignore the sheer number of men being incarcerated for civil debt. This tension in the media reflects a massive shift in the American consciousness regarding the male's role as a lifelong financial guarantor, regardless of the marriage's success. Step by step, the media began to build a narrative of the divorce mill. Places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and later Reno, Nevada, became the divorce capitals of the world. Historical journalism from the 1930s provides a vivid look at the 6-week residency requirements. Men would travel across the country, leaving their lives behind, just to find a jurisdiction that would grant them a decree without a decade of litigation. The newspapers portrayed these men as refugees from matrimony. These journalists would interview men on trains heading west, capturing a sense of desperation that is rarely discussed in standard history books. These accounts show a demographic of men who felt the legal system in their home states, like New York, which famously only allowed divorce for adultery until the 1960s, was a trap designed to extract wealth and status. During the Great Depression, the journalism surrounding divorce took on a darker, more pragmatic tone. Case studies from the 1930s highlight the pauper's divorce. With unemployment at record highs, many men simply could not afford the legal fees or the subsequent support payments. The newspapers of the time documented a rise in the poor man's divorce, which was simply desertion. Men would leave home to find work and never return. The media's coverage of these missing husbands created a social panic, leading to more stringent deadbeat laws. This era is crucial because it's where we see the transition from divorce being a moral failure to it being a financial crime in the eyes of the public. By the time we reach the post-World War II era, the 1950s, the journalism becomes almost surreal. The nuclear family was the American ideal, and the media treated divorce as a public health crisis. Men who sought divorce were often portrayed in magazines like Life or Look as being emotionally stunted or rebellious. There was a heavy psychological tilt to the reporting. Journalists worked with sociologists to explain why men were failing their families. This period is vital for understanding the modern stigma. The historical trend here moved away from the villain narrative and toward the broken man narrative. The media wasn't just reporting on the end of a marriage. It was diagnosing a perceived flaw in the American male's psyche. As we analyze these decades of reporting, a clear pattern emerges. The American media has always used the male experience in divorce as a proxy for larger social anxieties, whether it was about the sanctity of the home in the 1800s, the stability of the economy in the 1930s, or the psychological health of the nation in the 1950s. The potential outcomes for a man in these stories were almost always framed by what he could provide or what he had lost. This historical deep dive isn't just about old newspapers. It's about the foundation of the legal and social expectations that still exist today. In the next sections of this masterclass, we will break down the specific legal battles that these journalists covered, the alimony clubs formed by men in the 1920s to protest unfair laws, and the secret private eye industry that journalists relied on for their scoops. We are going to see how the detective agency ads in the back of 1940s newspapers were the precursors to modern digital surveillance in family law. We are peeling back the layers of a century of ink to see the real story of how we got here. Stay tuned because the transition from the 1950s shame era to the 1970s no-fault revolution is where the story gets even more intense. To understand the seismic shift from the era of moral shame to the revolution of no-fault divorce, we must first look at the middle of the 20th century through the lens of a case study. Imagine a man named Arthur in the year 1955. Arthur is a mid-level manager at a manufacturing firm in Ohio. In the eyes of his community, he is a success. But behind closed doors, his marriage has been dead for years. Under the laws of the time, as documented in the local Ohio journals, Arthur cannot simply walk away. To secure a divorce, he has to prove a crime. In 1955, the historical trends in journalism focused heavily on the concept of the matrimonial offense. If Arthur wants to leave, he or his wife must be found guilty of adultery, extreme cruelty, or willful desertion. Journalism during this period acted as a gatekeeper of these offenses. The local newspapers would publish lists of divorce filings that detailed the specific grounds for the split. If Arthur's wife sued him for extreme cruelty, that phrase would be printed next to his name for his boss and his neighbors to see. Historical archives show that extreme cruelty was often used as a legal catch-all, but in the court of public opinion, it suggested physical violence or mental instability. For a man in the 1950s, this wasn't just a legal hurdle, it was a professional death sentence. This led to a phenomenon that investigative journalists of the era began to call the divorce charade. Because the law required a guilty party, couples who both wanted to leave often engaged in collusion. This is where the private investigator industry, heavily advertised in the back pages of mid-century tabloids, became a central player in the American legal landscape. A man would hire a photographer and a model to pose for staged photos in a hotel room. These photos would then be presented in court as evidence of adultery. This was a choreographed ritual. The journalists of the time knew it was happening. Detailed exposés in magazines like Harper's Weekly in the late 1950s described these staged raids with cynical precision. These case studies reveal a system that forced men to perjure themselves and damage their own reputations just to gain the freedom to move on. The financial cost of these staged divorces was astronomical. When we look at the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and historical legal fees, a contested divorce in the 1950s could cost a man the equivalent of 2 years' salary. This created a two-tiered system of justice that journalism eventually began to critique. While wealthy men could afford the Reno residency or the staged hotel raids, the working-class man was often stuck in a state of legal limbo. This pressure cooker is what eventually led to the 1960s breaking point. By the mid-1960s, the tone of U.S. journalism began to shift from moralizing to sociological inquiry. Reporters started asking why the divorce rate was climbing despite the massive legal barriers. They began to profile the men who had become part of the alimony clubs of the era. These were informal groups of men who met in major cities like New York and Chicago to discuss the potential outcomes of their legal battles. They were protesting what they called the alimony trap. In 1965, a man who divorced was often expected to pay alimony for the rest of his life, or until his ex-wife remarried. There was no consideration of the woman's ability to work, as the social contract of the time viewed the man as the permanent provider regardless of the marital status. This historical trend is documented in long-form essays in The Atlantic and The New Yorker from that decade. They tell the stories of men who, despite having no children, were paying 60% of their income to a former spouse decades after a 2-year marriage had ended. These stories created the first real wave of public sympathy for the divorced man. Journalists began to use the term marital bankruptcy to describe the financial ruin these men faced. This media coverage was the fuel for the legislative fire that would soon become the no-fault revolution. In 1969, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the first no-fault divorce law, and the media coverage was explosive. The San Francisco Chronicle and the Los Angeles Times framed this as the end of the divorce charade. No longer would a man like Arthur have to stage a hotel raid or prove cruelty. He could simply state that the marriage had irreconcilable differences. However, the journalism of the early 1970s reveals an unintended consequence that hit men with the force of a freight train. While it became easier to get out of a marriage, the financial and custodial frameworks remained stuck in the 1950s. Journalists in the 1970s began to report on a new phenomenon: the rise of the contested custody battle. Previously, if a man was the innocent party in a fault-based divorce, he had a slight legal standing for custody. But with the advent of no fault, the legal standard shifted toward the tender years doctrine, which presumed that young children belonged with the mother. Historical case studies from the mid-70s show a massive spike in men's rights advocacy groups, appearing in local news segments. These men were often World War II and Korean War veterans who felt that the system had moved the goalposts. They had fought for their country, worked their entire lives, and now the law allowed their homes and children to be removed without them ever having committed a legal fault. The data from this era is staggering. Between 1970 and 1980, the divorce rate in the U.S. doubled. Journalism responded with a wave of crisis reporting. Headlines warned of the vanishing father and the rise of the single-parent household. But the focus for men was increasingly on the legal mechanics. This was the era when the term silver bullet began to appear in legal journalism, referring to allegations made during a divorce to secure an advantage in custody or property division. The historical archives of the 1980s show a massive increase in investigative pieces on how domestic relations courts were becoming the most volatile branch of the American judiciary. Step by step, we see the media moving away from the sad husband trope and toward the litigant. The man was now a party in a high-stakes civil suit. This led to the professionalization of divorce. The 1980s saw the rise of the celebrity divorce lawyer, men and women who became media stars by representing high-profile men and securing what the press called record-breaking settlements. This shifted the public's perception again. If you were a man getting a divorce in 1985, the media told you that you were in a war, and you needed a mercenary to survive it. But what happened when the cameras turned away? What was the reality for the average man who wasn't a celebrity? The historical trends show a massive disparity between the Hollywood divorce and the Main Street divorce. While the press focused on the millions lost by actors and athletes, the real story was in the small-town papers reporting on the closure of family-owned businesses and the liquidation of retirement accounts. By the late 1980s, the divorce industry was a multi-billion-dollar machine, and the American man was its primary fuel. We are looking at a trajectory where the law became more efficient at ending marriages, but the media became more efficient at monetizing the conflict. The transition from the moral judgment of the 19th century to the bureaucratic coldness of the late 20th century changed the way men viewed their own roles in society. It created a sense of guardedness that persists to this day. But as we move into the 1990s and the early 2000s, a new factor enters the chat: the internet. And with it, the way divorce is reported, debated, and weaponized changes forever. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the deadbeat dad media campaigns of the 1990s and how federal legislation was influenced by sensationalist journalism. We will explore the Million Man March era and the rise of the first online forums where men began to share their legal strategies, bypassing traditional media altogether. The shift from the printing press to the pixel changed the leverage forever, and you need to see how the public shaming of the 1800s evolved into the digital footprint of the modern era. The loop is closing, and the stakes are about to get much higher. The dawn of the 1990s marked a pivotal transformation in how the American man was depicted in the cultural zeitgeist of journalism. To understand this, we must look at a specific case study that dominated the headlines: the rise of the deadbeat dad narrative. Imagine a man named David in 1992. David is a blue-collar worker in Michigan who loses his job during the early 90s recession. Because his child support was calculated based on his peak earnings, and the legal process to modify those payments is slow and expensive, he falls behind. In the 1950s, David's struggle might have been a private family matter. In the 1990s, David becomes a headline. Historical trends in journalism during this decade show a massive surge in localized shaming campaigns. Newspapers across the United States began publishing most wanted lists for child support. Unlike the bed and board notices of the 1800s, which were focused on protecting a man's credit, these 1990s publications were state-sponsored and media-amplified campaigns intended to induce social pressure. For David, this meant his face appeared in the Sunday Circular next to violent offenders. Journalists at the time often failed to distinguish between the deadbeat, the man who could pay but chose not to, and the dead broke, the man who simply lacked the means. This lack of nuance in the press created a monolithic image of the divorced father that influenced federal policy. The peak of this era was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996. Journalism played a massive role in building the public consensus for this legislation. Reporters focused on the fiscal burden that fatherless households placed on the state, using data to argue that aggressive enforcement was the only solution. Case studies from this period reveal that the media began to celebrate the revocation of professional and driver's licenses for men in arrears. The journalistic narrative was clear: the divorced man was a potential liability to the taxpayer. This era cemented the idea that a man's value in the eyes of the law was primarily his role as a financial conduit. However, as the 1990s progressed, a counter-narrative began to emerge in the alternative press. Imagine if David, instead of just accepting the narrative, had access to a community of men in similar positions. This is where we see the birth of fathers' rights journalism. Small, independent newsletters and early digital bulletin boards began to report on the lack of visitation enforcement. While the mainstream press was obsessed with child support collection rates, the underground press was documenting a different set of data: the thousands of hours of court-ordered parenting time that went unenforced. This was the first time in U.S. history that men began to use the tools of journalism to present their own data-driven arguments against the prevailing social tide. As we moved into the late 90s, the Million Man March and subsequent rallies focused on the family unit brought these issues to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Mainstream outlets like CNN and the New York Times were forced to cover a new angle: the man who wanted to be a father but was being treated by the system as a visitor. Historical trends show that the language in journalism started to soften slightly, introducing terms like co-parenting and joint custody into the common vernacular. The shift was slow, and the legal machinery was still largely geared toward the primary caregiver model established decades prior. The year 1998 brought another massive shift with the widespread adoption of the internet. This changed the leverage forever. Before the internet, if a man was unfairly characterized in a local newspaper's divorce report, that paper eventually became birdcage liner or was buried in a library microfilm archive. But with the digitalization of news, those headlines became permanent. We call this the digital footprint era. A man's most difficult personal moment was now searchable by future employers, partners, and his own children. Journalism was no longer a temporary record. It was a permanent, global ledger. Step by step, the 2000s saw the professionalization of this digital shaming. The rise of gossip blogs and early social media meant that divorce for men became a spectator sport. We see this in the media coverage of high-profile splits where the male's financial disclosures were leaked and dissected in real time. This created a new type of pressure for the average man. He saw what happened to the wealthy and famous and realized that in the digital age, privacy was a luxury he could no longer afford. The data shows that this period saw a spike in men seeking prenuptial agreements, not just to protect assets, but to include confidentiality clauses to prevent the journalistic exploitation of their private lives. Case studies from the mid-2000s, specifically during the 2008 financial crisis, highlight a devastating trend. As the housing market collapsed, journalism began to report on the mancession. Men were losing jobs at a higher rate than women, yet their divorce obligations remained fixed. The press documented a tragic rise in what they termed divorce-related bankruptcy. The narrative shifted from the deadbeat of the 90s to the obsolete man of the 2000s. Journalists interviewed men who were living in their cars while still paying mortgages on houses they were legally barred from entering. This era of reporting was raw and unfiltered, reflecting a growing sense of alienation among divorced men. But there was a silver lining in the evolution of journalism. The rise of the manosphere and independent content creators in the 2010s started to provide a platform for stories that the mainstream media wouldn't touch. These weren't just rants. They were deep dives into the statutory math of alimony and the psychological impact of parental alienation. Men began to act as their own journalists, using YouTube and blogs to break down the potential outcomes of specific legal strategies. They shared case law, interviewed attorneys, and created a repository of knowledge that was once hidden behind a paywall of legal fees. By the time we reach the current decade, the landscape has changed entirely. Journalism is now decentralized. A man facing divorce in 2026 has more information at his fingertips than a Supreme Court justice had in 1970. But this comes with a new set of risks. The sheer volume of information can lead to analysis paralysis. We see historical trends of men attempting to represent themselves based on internet research, often with disastrous results. The media's role has shifted from being a source of news to being a filter for noise. We are now living in an era where the public shaming of the 1800s has been replaced by the algorithmic targeting of the 2020s. If you search for divorce advice today, the ads that follow you across the web are a modern form of the bed and board notice. Your digital behavior is being tracked and monetized by the very industry that once used ink and paper to tell your story. The stakes are no longer just about your reputation in your hometown. They are about your data, your privacy, and your ability to define your own future in an age of total transparency. As we look at the evolution from the printing press to the pixel, we see that the American man's struggle in the divorce system has always been a reflection of the technology of the time. The media hasn't just recorded this history, it has driven it. But there is one final piece of the puzzle we haven't touched on yet. It is the most controversial and perhaps the most important shift in the last 150 years. It involves the secret role of the insurance industry and the tax code in shaping the modern divorce experience. In the next part, we are going to expose the hidden financial architecture that journalists rarely talk about. We are going to look at the Tax Reform Act of 1984 and how it changed the way alimony was treated, creating a massive shift in how men negotiated their exits. We will also dive into the rise of divorce insurance and the media's role in selling the idea that marriage is a high-risk investment. The paper trail goes deeper than you think, and the next chapter reveals who really profits when a marriage ends. The money side of the story is about to be blown wide open. The paper trail of divorce in the United States is not just a collection of court orders. It is a financial ledger that has been systematically rewritten by shifting tax codes and legislative maneuvers. To understand why a man's financial landscape looks the way it does in 2026, we have to look at the Tax Reform Act of 1984. Before this moment, the IRS and the journalistic coverage surrounding it treated alimony as a relatively straightforward deduction for the payer and income for the recipient. But the mid-1980s saw a massive shift in how the government viewed the redistribution of wealth during a marital split. Imagine a man named Robert in 1985. Robert is a senior engineer who has spent 20 years building a pension and a portfolio. Under the new rules reported extensively by financial columnists in the Wall Street Journal at the time, Robert discovered that the government was becoming a silent partner in his divorce. The Tax Reform Act of 1984 introduced the concept of recapture rules to prevent people from disguising property settlements as alimony. Journalism from this period shows a surge in articles explaining how the front-loading of alimony could lead to massive tax penalties. For Robert, this meant that the financial negotiations of his divorce were no longer just between him and his spouse. They were a complex three-way dance with the Internal Revenue Service. This era marked the birth of the divorce financial planner, a profession that the media quickly began to profile as the new must-have for any man with significant assets. The historical trends of the late 80s and early 90s show a fascinating correlation between tax policy and divorce strategy. Journalists began to report on the alimony trust and the use of qualified domestic relations orders, or QDROs. These were technical tools that allowed for the division of retirement accounts without immediate tax penalties. However, the complexity of these instruments meant that a man's legal fees often skyrocketed. The media coverage of this era often focused on the sheer math of the split. Reporters would break down case studies showing that a man earning six figures could end up with a lower standard of living than his non-working spouse due to the way tax brackets and support payments interacted. Step by step, the media's fascination with the economics of divorce led to the rise of what journalists termed the divorce industry. By the late 1990s, trade journals for the legal and insurance industries began discussing the viability of divorce insurance. While this sounds like a modern concept, the historical archives show that insurance companies were exploring ways to hedge against the financial volatility of marital dissolution decades ago. The journalistic narrative shifted to treating marriage as a high-stakes financial merger. This had a profound effect on the American male's psyche. Business journals started publishing advice that treated a wedding ring like a liability on a balance sheet. The narrative was no longer about the moral failure of a broken home. It was about the risk management of a failing asset. Let us look at a specific case study from the early 2000s that illustrates this risk management era. Imagine a man named Mark, an entrepreneur in the growing tech sector of Austin, Texas. In 2004, the media was obsessed with the dot-com bust and its aftermath. Mark's divorce was captured in local business journals not because of a scandal, but because of his stock options. The journalists of the time detailed how the courts were struggling to value future earnings and intellectual property. This created a new kind of journalistic trope: the man who was forced to pay out cash based on the projected value of a company that might go bankrupt tomorrow. This reporting highlighted a terrifying potential outcome for men in the innovation economy: being tied to a debt based on a ghost valuation. As we move into the mid-2010s, the financial journalism surrounding divorce took another sharp turn with the introduction of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. This was a bombshell for the American man that the media covered with intense scrutiny. For over 70 years, alimony had been tax-deductible for the payer. In 2017, that was abolished for any divorce finalized after December 31, 2018. Journalists at Forbes and Bloomberg pointed out the immediate impact. The cost of divorce for the higher-earning spouse, typically the man in these case studies, had effectively increased by 20 to 30% overnight. The media reported on a frantic rush to the courthouse in late 2018, as men tried to finalize decrees before the tax benefit vanished. This wasn't about love or custody. It was a pure race against the tax clock, documented in real time by the national press. The data from the post-2018 era shows a significant shift in how settlements are structured. Because alimony is no longer deductible, journalists have noted a trend toward larger lump sum property settlements instead of monthly payments. This has created a new set of risks. A man might give up his entire share of the home equity to avoid a monthly payment that is no longer tax-advantaged. The media coverage of these trade-offs often uses the term the house-rich, cash-poor divorcee. This reflects a reality where men are sacrificing their long-term liquidity for short-term peace of mind, a trend that financial journalists continue to analyze as we approach the present day. But the story of the money goes beyond just taxes and insurance. It reaches into the very heart of the American credit system. In 2026, we see the culmination of a century of reporting on the credit score as a weapon of war. Historically, as far back as those 19th century newspaper notices, a man's credit was his reputation. Today, investigative journalism reveals how the modern divorce process can lead to what is called credit suicide. Case studies show men who, faced with insurmountable temporary support orders, are forced to default on obligations, destroying a lifetime of financial standing in a matter of months. The media's role in this has evolved from printing notices to providing tools for credit monitoring and identity protection during a split. The financial architecture of divorce is designed to be a closed loop, where the legal fees, tax obligations, and support payments create a vacuum that can drain a man's resources regardless of the outcome. Journalists have begun to call this the friction cost of divorce. It is the money that disappears into the system itself, never reaching either spouse or the children. Historical trends suggest that this friction cost has grown from a negligible amount in the era of simple separations to a staggering percentage of the total marital estate in the 21st century. We are looking at a system where the financial stakes have been raised so high that the journalism surrounding it feels more like war reporting than social commentary. The man in this system is often portrayed as a figure navigating a minefield, where one wrong step in a deposition or a tax filing can lead to decades of repercussions. But even as the financial story reaches its peak, another more invisible force has been at work. It is a force that doesn't just take a man's money, but his time, his legacy, and his very identity. In the next part, we are going to dive into the most sensitive area of all, the evolution of custody journalism. We will look at how the media moved from the tender years doctrine to the best interests of the child standard, and why these phrases were often used by journalists to mask a deeper reality. We are going to explore the rise of the fatherhood movement in the media, and the specific case studies that changed the way the American public views the importance of a father's presence. The battle for the pocketbook was only the beginning. The battle for the cradle is where the real history of the American man's resilience is written. The battle for the cradle began with a legal doctrine so deeply embedded in American journalism that it was rarely questioned for nearly a century. This was the tender years doctrine. To understand its impact, imagine a man named Thomas in 1925. Thomas is a hard-working carpenter in Chicago. When his marriage dissolves, the local newspapers of the era reflect a rigid social consensus. Children of a tender age, usually defined as under 7, belonged exclusively with the mother. Journalism from the 1920s portrayed this not as a legal bias, but as a biological imperative. Articles in the Sunday supplements would often feature sentimental prose about the sacred bond between mother and child, while the father was relegated to the role of the distant provider. For Thomas, this meant that the potential outcomes of a custody hearing were decided before he even stepped into the courtroom. The media narrative of the time simply didn't have a category for the nurturing father. Historical trends show that this doctrine was so powerful that men often didn't even fight for custody, because the press had convinced them it was impossible. Investigative pieces from the early 20th century show that when a father did seek custody, he was often framed by journalists as being motivated by spite rather than love. The case studies of that era are heartbreaking. They detail men who were granted 2 hours of visitation on a Sunday afternoon, supervised in a public park, while the newspapers praised the court for protecting the sanctity of the maternal nest. This journalistic framing created a self-fulfilling prophecy where fathers became visitors because society, through its media, told them that was all they could be. As we move into the 1970s, the narrative began to crack, but not in the way many expected. With the rise of the second-wave feminist movement, journalism started to focus on the double burden of the working mother. This opened a small window for the discussion of paternal involvement. However, the media coverage of the 1970s and 80s introduced a new, equally complex standard: the best interests of the child. On the surface, this sounded like a victory for fairness. Journalists hailed it as a move toward a gender-neutral system. But when we look at the actual reporting from the 1980s, we see that the best interest standard was often used by the press to pathologize the father's lifestyle. Imagine if Thomas had a grandson, also named Thomas, going through a divorce in 1984. The younger Thomas is a devoted father, but because he works 45 hours a week to pay the mortgage and the impending child support, the local media and the court-appointed evaluators frame his work ethic as an absence. The historical archives of the 1980s are filled with stories of the career-focused father versus the stay-at-home mother. The journalism of the time rarely acknowledged that the man's absence was often a functional requirement of his role as the financial guarantor. This created a catch-22 that was documented in hundreds of op-eds. The man was either a deadbeat for not providing enough or an absentee for working too much. Step by step, the 1990s saw the rise of a more aggressive form of custody journalism. This was the era of the high-conflict divorce exposé. Magazines like People and Vanity Fair began to run deep dives into the custody battles of the elite, and these stories trickled down to the local level. These reports introduced the public to the concept of parental alienation. While today we recognize this as a serious issue, the journalism of the 90s often treated it as a sensationalist plot point. Case studies from this period show that fathers who claimed they were being erased from their children's lives were often dismissed by the mainstream press as being disgruntled. However, the data from the late 90s started to show a shift in public opinion, largely driven by the independent press and the early internet. Men began to organize, and their stories of being locked out of school plays and holiday celebrations started to gain traction. Reporters began to look at the statistics of fatherless homes, often linking them to juvenile delinquency and social instability. While this was a heavy-handed approach, it did force the media to reconsider the father's role as more than just a paycheck. The narrative started to evolve from the father as an optional extra to the father as a necessary component of a healthy society. By the 2010s, we see the emergence of the shared parenting movement in the headlines. States like Kentucky and Florida became the focus of intense journalistic scrutiny as they moved toward a presumption of 50-50 custody. The media coverage of these legislative battles was fascinating. For the first time, major outlets were running data-driven pieces showing that children in shared parenting arrangements had better emotional and educational outcomes. This was a radical departure from the tender year stories of a century prior. The historical trend was moving toward equity, and the journalism was finally catching up to the lived reality of many American men. But even in 2026, the battle for the cradle remains a central theme in the media. Today we see the rise of the digital custody war. Journalists are now reporting on how social media posts, GPS tracking data, and even smart home recordings are being used in custody hearings. Imagine a man today whose every weekend with his children is documented and analyzed by an algorithm or a hostile party. The journalism of 2026 focuses on the surveillance state of the modern divorce. We see case studies of men who have to live under a microscope, where a single misunderstood text message can become a headline in a custody evaluation. The historical arc of custody journalism is a journey from the silent provider to the scrutinized co-parent. It is a story of how the American man has fought to be recognized not just for what he does, but for who he is to his children. The newspapers of the 19th century might have ignored him, the tabloids of the 20th century might have vilified him, but the digital archives of the 21st century are beginning to record a more nuanced truth. The resilience of the American father is a recurring theme that has survived every shift in the legal and social landscape. But there is a darker side to this historical record that we must address. While the battle for custody and cash was happening in the light of the courtroom, a more clandestine industry was operating in the shadows. It is an industry that journalists have both leaned on and exposed for over 100 years. The world of private surveillance and character assassination. This is where the divorce process stops being a civil matter and starts becoming a psychological operation. In the next part, we are going to dive into the history of the divorce spy. We will look at the evolution from the gumshoe private eyes of the 1940s to the high-tech digital forensics experts of today. We will see how journalists use leaked surveillance to destroy reputations, and how men have historically been the primary targets of these sting operations. We are going to look at the secret files, the hidden cameras, and the evolution of the setup. The level of sophistication in these tactics will shock you, and it reveals just how far the industry will go to gain an edge in the American court system. The eye in the sky is watching, and the next chapter is about how it changed everything. The history of the divorce spy is as old as the American printing press itself, but the sophistication of the tradecraft has evolved from crude stakeouts to invisible digital sieges. To understand the gravity of this, imagine a man named James in 1948. James is a returning war veteran working in a bustling post-war economy. In the journalism of the late 1940s, private investigators were often romanticized in film noir, but in the reality of the family court pages, they were the ultimate agents of destruction. Because divorce still required proof of fault in almost every state, the private investigator was not an optional luxury. He was a legal necessity. The historical archives of the 1940s and 50s are littered with advertisements for domestic surveillance. Journalists of the era often collaborated with these investigators to get the scoop on high-profile socialites. The standard operating procedure was the raid. A man would be followed for weeks, his every movement documented in a leather-bound logbook. If he so much as had dinner with a female colleague, the investigator would orchestrate a staged confrontation, often bringing along a flashbulb photographer to capture a compromising, albeit often misleading, image. This was the era of character assassination by lens. The journalism of the time used these grainy photos to sell papers, and the potential outcomes for the man were devastating. Loss of employment, social ostracization, and a total wipeout in the courtroom. Step by step, the 1960s saw this industry professionalize even further. The investigative reports of that decade began to detail the use of wiretapping. Before the strict privacy laws of the modern era, it was a common journalistic trope to discuss the bugging of the family home. Case studies from 1962 show men discovering microphones hidden in lamps or behind baseboards. The media's fascination with these gadgets turned divorce from a legal dispute into a Cold War. For a man during this period, the privacy of his own home was non-existent. Journalists reported on these tactics with a mixture of horror and fascination, often blurring the lines between reporting on a crime and providing a manual for one. By the 1980s, the technology shifted from audio to video. The introduction of the camcorder changed the historical trends of surveillance journalism. Now, the media could broadcast actual footage of a man's private life. Investigative segments on local news stations began featuring sting operations where reporters followed private eyes on their rounds. This created a new psychological pressure. Imagine if James's son Michael was going through a divorce in 1988. Michael had to assume that every time he walked to his car or entered a restaurant, he was being filmed. The journalism of the late 80s framed this as the accountability era. But for the men living through it, it was a period of intense paranoia. The press didn't just report the news. They created an atmosphere where every action was a potential exhibit for the prosecution. As we transitioned into the 1990s, the surveillance industry met the digital age. The reporting shifted toward the forensic analysis of early home computers. Historical archives from the mid-90s show a rise in articles about the digital trail. Journalists interviewed computer experts who could recover deleted files or track early internet browsing history. This was a massive shift because it meant that a man's thoughts and interests were now subject to discovery. The media's role in this was to amplify the fear. Headlines warned of the hidden dangers of the hard drive, and for the first time, the man's intellectual privacy was on the chopping block alongside his financial and physical privacy. In the current landscape of 2026, the divorce spy has gone completely invisible. We are no longer talking about a man in a trench coat with a camera. We are talking about data brokers and digital forensics. Today, journalism reports on the weaponization of the Internet of Things. Imagine a man today whose smart thermostat, his doorbell camera, and even his fitness tracker are being subpoenaed to prove his location, his habits, and his associations. Case studies in 2026 highlight how metadata is the new star witness. Journalists are detailing how a man's own devices are being used to build a narrative against him. The historical trend has moved from the external spy to the internal informant. The data from recent years shows a staggering increase in the use of electronic evidence in family law. Over 90% of divorce attorneys report a spike in evidence gathered from social media and mobile devices. Journalism has followed this trend with cautionary tales of the one-off post or the forgotten tag that cost a man his custody or his settlement. The media narrative in 2026 is one of total transparency, where the concept of a private life is treated as an archaic relic. This shift has profound implications for how men navigate the world. It leads to a state of constant self-censorship, a theme that modern journalists are only just beginning to explore in depth. One of the most controversial aspects of this surveillance history is the setup. Historically, journalists have documented instances where investigators were hired not just to watch a man, but to tempt him. The honey trap is a recurring theme in the annals of American journalism. Case studies from the 1970s and 80s describe situations where attractive operatives were sent to interact with a man in a vulnerable state, with the goal of creating a compromising situation that could be photographed and used as leverage. While modern journalism often condemns these tactics, the historical record shows they were remarkably effective and widely ignored by the authorities for decades. This culture of surveillance has created a specific type of legal journalism, the character assassination piece. This is where the media uses leaked surveillance or selected digital footprints to create a public image of a man that is impossible to shake. We see this in the reporting of celebrity divorces, but it happens every day at the local level. A man becomes a caricature based on a handful of data points. The nuance of a 20-year marriage is stripped away in favor of a 30-second clip or a single screenshot. This is the reality of the American man in the eyes of the digital press. He is the sum of his worst moments captured in high definition. The resilience required to withstand this level of scrutiny is immense. When we look at the historical trajectory, we see that men have had to become increasingly sophisticated in their own defense. They have moved from hiding their mail to encrypting their communications. The journalism of the 21st century reflects this arms race. We see articles on how to secure your digital identity and how to conduct yourself under the constant gaze of the camera. The eye in the sky hasn't just changed the divorce process. It has changed the American man's relationship with technology and with society itself. We have explored the moral shame of the 19th century, the financial warfare of the 20th, and the digital surveillance of the 21st. But there is one final pillar of this historical deep dive that ties all these elements together. It is something that exists in every newspaper headline and every court transcript, yet it is rarely named. It is the language of the narrative itself. It is how the media uses specific words to frame the man as either the hero, the villain, or the victim. In the next part, we are going to break down the linguistic evolution of divorce journalism. We will look at how the terms used to describe men have shifted from provider to breadwinner to obligor. We will see how these labels aren't just words, but legal and social traps that dictate how a man is treated by the system. We are going to look at the power of the headline and how the word war is often won before the case ever reaches a judge. The vocabulary of your life is being written by someone else, and it is time to see the dictionary they are using. The dictionary of the American divorce has been rewritten every 30 years, and the words chosen by journalists have acted as the invisible bars of a man's cage. To understand the power of a label, we must go back to the mid-1800s and look at the term provider. In the historical journalism of the Civil War era, a provider was a title of absolute dignity. If a newspaper reported on a man's divorce, his status as a provider was his primary defense. If he had kept a roof over the family's head and coal in the stove, the journalists of the time often framed the wife's departure as an act of irrationality or ingratitude. The provider was a pillar of the community. However, as the Industrial Revolution took hold, the term began to shift. By the 1890s, journalists started using the word breadwinner. This seems like a small change, but the linguistic data reveals a narrowing of the male identity. A provider is someone who manages a household. A breadwinner is someone who simply brings in the raw capital. Historical trends show that once the media shifted to the term breadwinner, the man's emotional and physical presence in the home began to be treated as secondary in the press. Imagine a man named Henry in 1910. He works 12 hours a day in a steel mill in Pittsburgh. When his marriage fails, the local paper doesn't ask if he loved his children. They ask if he was an efficient breadwinner. If he was expected to pay. If he wasn't, he was ridiculed. Journalism began to reduce the complex reality of a husband to a simple economic function. This was the first step in the dehumanization of the male litigant. The headlines of the early 20th century didn't see a father. They saw a financial engine. As we move into the mid-20th century, specifically the 1940s and 50s, the vocabulary shifted again. This was the era of the head of household. In the post-war journalism of magazines like Saturday Evening Post, the head of household was a position of authority but also of total liability. If the household broke, the head was responsible for the repair costs. Case studies from the late 1950s show that when journalists wrote about divorce, they used the term maintenance instead of support. Think about that word. Maintenance is what you do for a car or a building. It implies that the woman was a ward of the man, and he was legally required to maintain her in the condition to which she had become accustomed. This language, popularized by the legal correspondents of the time, cemented the idea that a man's financial obligation was a permanent mortgage on his future, regardless of the emotional status of the relationship. Step by step, the most damaging linguistic shift occurred in the 1970s and 80s. This is when the term obligor entered the journalistic lexicon. If you look at court reporting from the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune starting in the late 70s, the word father or husband began to disappear from legal news, replaced by obligor. This is a cold, bureaucratic term. An obligor is someone who owes a debt. By adopting the language of the courtroom, journalists help the public view the divorced man as a walking balance sheet. At the same time, the media began to use the term visitor to describe a man's relationship with his children. A visitor is someone who doesn't belong, someone who is there by the grace of someone else's permission. The historical trend of the 1980s was to use these words to psychologically distance the man from his own family unit. Imagine if Henry's great-grandson Brian was going through a divorce in 1995. The journalism of the 90s didn't call him a father trying to see his kids. It called him a non-custodial parent. This phrase is a masterpiece of linguistic erasure. It defines the man by what he is not. It tells the public that he is the secondary character in his own life. Investigative pieces from the 1990s on child support enforcement almost exclusively used the term pair. The media created a binary. There was the custodial parent, who was the hero, and the payer, who was the resource. This linguistic framework made it incredibly difficult for men to argue for shared parenting, because how can an obligor or a payer be a primary caregiver? The words themselves blocked the path to equity. In the current landscape of 2026, we are seeing the rise of a new and perhaps even more dangerous set of terms. Today, journalists and social media commentators use the word privilege to describe a man's financial stability during a divorce. The historical trend has moved from the man as a provider to the man as an exploiter. We see case studies where a man's 20 years of labor are reframed in the press as unfair advantage. This shifts the potential outcomes of a divorce from a fair division of assets to a form of social redistribution. The journalism of 2026 often focuses on the gender pay gap as a justification for punitive alimony awards, using broad sociological data to override the specific facts of an individual man's life and sacrifices. Another modern linguistic trap is the phrase high conflict. When the media describes a divorce as high conflict, they are often using a code that signals to the public and to the judges who read these papers that the man is being difficult. Historical archives show that when a woman fights for her rights in court, the media calls her empowered. When a man fights for his rights, he is often labeled as litigious or high conflict. This double standard in the vocabulary of journalism creates a massive hurdle for men. It discourages them from seeking a fair outcome because they fear the social stigma of being the man who won't just let it go. But why does this vocabulary matter so much? It matters because the law follows the language. When journalists spend 30 years calling men obligors, the legislature eventually writes laws for obligors, not for fathers. When the media uses the term deadbeat as a catch-all for any man behind on payments, the court system stops looking for the nuances of job loss or illness. The vocabulary of journalism is the blueprint for the architecture of the law. By understanding these words, we can start to see how the system was built and, more importantly, how it can be challenged. The data from linguistic studies of legal documents and media reports shows a clear correlation between the use of dehumanizing language and the severity of judicial outcomes. In jurisdictions where the local press still uses more traditional family-oriented language, men often see more equitable custody and support arrangements. In areas where the media has fully adopted the bureaucratic lexicon of the state, the outcomes are significantly more lopsided. This is the word war, and it is being fought in every newspaper, every blog post, and every news segment in the country. We have traced the evolution of the American man from the pillar of the community to the obligor of the state. We have seen how the media has used shame, money, surveillance, and language to shape the experience of divorce. But there is one final group of people we haven't discussed: the ones who sit in the dark corners of the newsroom and the courtroom, pulling the strings of the narrative. They are the influencers before the internet existed. They are the ones who decided which stories to tell and which to bury. In the next part, we are going to look at the gatekeepers. We will go inside the editorial meetings of the 20th century to see how they decided to frame the American man. We will explore the secret relationship between the legal lobby and the mainstream press. We are going to look at the case studies of the stories that were killed because they were too sympathetic to the father's perspective. The curtain is about to be pulled back on the people who manufacture the public's reality. The secrets of the newsroom are coming to light, and you will finally see how the narrative is managed. The gatekeepers of the American narrative have always operated in the quiet spaces where policy meets the printing press. To understand how the divorced man became a caricature in the eyes of the public, we have to look at the editorial engine rooms of the mid-20th century. Imagine a senior editor at a major New York daily in 1968. He is looking at two potential stories for the Sunday feature. One is a detailed investigative piece about the systemic lack of due process in family courts and the rising rate of male suicide following child access denial. The other is a sensationalist exposé on a wealthy playboy dodging his alimony payments in the south of France. Historical trends show that the playboy story won every single time. This was not an accident of interest. It was a calculated decision based on the financial survival of the newsroom itself. Journalism in the United States has always relied on conflict to drive circulation. But there is a deeper layer. During the 1960s and 70s, the relationship between the legal lobby and the mainstream press became a closed loop. Law firms and bar associations were major advertisers and primary sources for legal reporters. When state bar associations pushed for no-fault legislation or stricter support enforcement, they provided the data and the human interest stories to the editors. Case studies from this era show that the stories provided were almost always skewed to highlight the necessity of state intervention. The narrative of the victimized woman and the predatory or negligent man was a product that sold papers and simultaneously supported the expansion of the family law industry. Step by step, the editorial process filtered out the complexities of the male experience. If a man tried to tell his story of being priced out of his own life by legal fees and temporary orders, it was often dismissed by editors as too technical or too bitter. The media developed a preference for what is known in the industry as the safe narrative. A safe narrative is one that confirms existing social biases, rather than challenging them. By the 1980s, this meant that the journalistic default was to frame any male pushback against the divorce system as a backlash against women's rights. This framing effectively killed any nuanced discussion about the structural inequities of the family court system for decades. Imagine if a man named Stephen, a schoolteacher in 1982, had attempted to write an op-ed about the psychological devastation of the tender years doctrine. Even if his writing was brilliant, the gatekeepers at his local paper would likely have spiked the piece. Why? Because at that time, the prevailing editorial wisdom was that fathers were secondary caregivers. To publish Stephen's piece would be to go against the sociological consensus of the era. This led to a massive data gap. For nearly 40 years, the American public was fed a diet of stories that reinforced the idea of the disposable father, simply because the alternative didn't fit the editorial brand of the major outlets. This management of the narrative extended into the burgeoning world of television news. The 1990s saw the rise of the tabloid talk show and the primetime news magazine. These formats required clear villains and heroes. Producers discovered that the deadbeat dad was the perfect villain for a 42-minute segment. Historical archives of shows from that decade reveal a pattern. They would find the most egregious, extreme examples of male parental failure and present them as the representative average. They rarely, if ever, interviewed the man who was working 2 jobs to keep up with an arrears balance that had ballooned due to interest rates higher than a credit card. By curating the extreme and presenting it as the norm, the gatekeepers manufactured a reality where the average man felt he was always one step away from being a public pariah. The data supports this narrative manipulation. Content analysis of major U.S. newspapers between 1980 and 2000 shows that when divorce was discussed, negative descriptors were used for men 4 times as often as for women. This wasn't necessarily a conscious conspiracy by every individual reporter, but it was a systemic bias built into the gatekeeping process. Reporters are trained to look for the underdog, and in the divorce narrative, the woman was historically cast as the underdog regardless of the financial or legal facts of the specific case. This left the man in a perpetual defensive crouch, unable to access the same level of journalistic empathy. As we move into the 2010s, the gatekeeping shifted from human editors to algorithms. In 2026, the way a man experiences divorce news is determined by what an AI thinks will keep him clicking. If you are a man in a legal battle today, the algorithm will feed you stories that trigger your fear or your anger, because those are the highest engagement emotions. The modern gatekeepers are no longer in newsrooms. They are in server farms in Silicon Valley. This has led to the fragmentation of the narrative. Instead of a shared public reality, we have echo chambers. Men are often pushed into radicalized spaces because the mainstream media still refuses to provide a balanced, data-driven look at the male experience in the family court system. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 show that when men's rights issues do break into the mainstream, they are often still handled with a tone of derision or suspicion. The gatekeepers have pivoted from ignoring the father's rights movement to labeling it as part of a dangerous manosphere. This is a classic move in narrative management. If you cannot stop the information, you discredit the source. By grouping legitimate concerns about legal equity and custody reform with extremist rhetoric, the media gatekeepers continue to prevent a serious national conversation about the evolution of divorce for men. The potential outcomes of this managed reality are profound. It affects everything from how a man negotiates his first meeting with a lawyer to how he speaks to his children about the split. If a man believes the media narrative that the system is 100% rigged against him, he may give up before the fight even begins. Conversely, if he believes the system is a meritocracy, he may be blindsided by the biases that still exist. The gatekeepers don't just tell us what to think, they tell us how to feel about our own lives. They set the boundaries of what is considered a reasonable demand in a courtroom. We are seeing a slow but steady rebellion against this gatekeeping. The rise of long-form broadcasting and independent investigative journalism has started to bypass the traditional editors. Men are now hearing hours-long interviews with family law reformers and social scientists that would never have been allowed on a 1990s news broadcast. This is the first time in historical U.S. journalism that the gatekeepers are losing their grip on the divorce narrative. The walls of the newsroom are crumbling, and the raw, unedited truth of the male experience is starting to leak out. However, the legacy of the old gatekeepers remains in the minds of the judges, the evaluators, and the general public who grew up on a diet of managed stories. The challenge for the man in 2026 is to navigate a world where the old lies are still being treated as common sense. We have seen how the narrative was manufactured, but we haven't seen how it was dismantled. There is a secret history of the men who fought back not in the courts, but in the media itself. In the next part, we are going to look at the underground press and the history of the male counterculture in divorce. We will explore the stories of the men who started their own magazines, their own radio shows, and their own pirate broadcasts to tell the side of the story that the gatekeepers tried to kill. We are going to look at the guerrilla journalism of the 1970s and 80s that paved the way for the digital revolution. The voice of the silenced is finally going to be heard, and you will see how the truth started to find a way out of the shadows. The historical rebellion of the American man against the mainstream divorce narrative did not begin on the internet. It began in the smudged ink of mimeograph machines and the static of pirate radio. To understand how the truth started to find its way out of the shadows, we must look at the underground press of the 1970s. Imagine a man named Daniel in 1974. Daniel is a veteran and an engineer who has been blocked from seeing his daughters for 2 years despite a court order. The local newspaper won't run his letters to the editor. The television stations ignore his protests. So Daniel does something radical. He joins a small collective of men in a basement in Boston to produce a newsletter called The Father's Voice. This was the birth of guerrilla journalism in the context of family law. Historical trends from the mid-70s show a massive explosion in these self-published periodicals. They weren't polished and they weren't professional, but they were the only places in America where a man could read a data-driven breakdown of the disparate outcomes in alimony awards or the lack of enforcement in visitation interference. Case studies of these early newsletters reveal a sophisticated level of legal analysis that the mainstream gatekeepers were too afraid to touch. These men were essentially acting as their own legal correspondents, translating complex statutes into plain English for thousands of other men who felt isolated and defeated by the system. Step by step, these underground publications began to coordinate. By the early 1980s, the movement had moved into the world of community access television and low-power FM radio. Journalists from the traditional outlets often mocked these efforts, calling them the angry men on the airwaves. But the data shows that these broadcasts were a lifeline. In cities like Detroit and Los Angeles, late-night radio shows became forums where men could call in and share their specific experiences with certain judges or evaluators. This was the first iteration of what we now call crowdsourced data. Before there were online reviews for lawyers, there was the underground radio network where men warned each other about the potential outcomes of hiring specific high-priced firms that were known for churning fees without results. Imagine if Daniel's efforts in 1974 had the reach of a modern podcast. Back then, he was lucky to reach 500 people. But by the late 80s, the guerrilla press began to influence the mainstream. Journalists who were looking for a fresh angle started to attend the rallies organized by these underground groups. The historical record shows a shift in the early 90s where major news magazines like Time and Newsweek finally began to run cover stories on the plight of the divorced father. These mainstream articles didn't happen because the editors had a change of heart. They happened because the underground press had created so much noise that the story could no longer be ignored. The guerrilla journalists had successfully moved the needle of public opinion by sheer persistence. The transition from paper to digital in the late 1990s was the final blow to the gatekeepers' monopoly. The early internet allowed for the creation of the first national databases of family law cases. This was a journalistic revolution. For the first time, a man in Florida could compare his case to a man in Washington and realize that the systemic biases he was facing weren't just local anomalies. They were part of a national historical trend. Website forums like Father's Rights America and Dad's Divorce became the new town squares. The journalism on these sites was raw, often unfiltered, and deeply analytical. They didn't just report on the law, they taught men how to read the law. Case studies from the 2000s show how this digital counterculture began to strike back against character assassination. When a local newspaper would run a one-sided story about a man in a custody battle, these online communities would perform their own investigative journalism. They would find the court transcripts, the financial records, and the evidence that the mainstream reporter had conveniently left out. They would then publish these findings on blogs and forums, effectively creating a permanent digital record that countered the official narrative. This was the beginning of the end for the single-source divorce story. The American man had finally found a way to defend his reputation in the court of public opinion. By the 2010s, this counterculture had matured into the manosphere, a decentralized network of content creators, bloggers, and YouTubers. While the mainstream media often focuses on the most controversial aspects of this space, the historical reality is that it provided a massive amount of educational content. Historical trends in this era show a surge in videos and articles explaining the math of child support guidelines and the psychological tactics used in high-conflict litigation. Journalists in the 2020s have had to acknowledge that these independent creators often have more influence and deeper data than the legacy newsrooms. A single video from a specialized divorce consultant on YouTube can reach millions of men, providing them with more practical information in 20 minutes than a century of traditional reporting ever did. In 2026, the underground has become the mainstream for men navigating the system. We see a landscape where independent investigative journalism is the primary source of truth for the American man. Imagine a man today who, instead of picking up a newspaper, tunes into a live-streamed breakdown of a recent Supreme Court ruling on parental rights. He is participating in a global conversation with thousands of other men who are analyzing the potential outcomes in real time. The voice of the silenced is no longer a whisper in a basement. It is a roar that is felt in the halls of every legislature in the country. The data from the last decade indicates that this shift in journalism has had a direct impact on legislative reform. In states where independent media has been most active in highlighting the flaws of the current system, we have seen the most significant movements toward equal shared parenting and alimony reform. The journalism of the rebellion has proven that information is the most powerful tool for social change. By breaking the monopoly of the gatekeepers, these men didn't just change the narrative, they changed the law. However, this victory came at a high price. The history of the male counterculture is also a history of personal sacrifice. Many of the men who started these early newsletters and radio shows lost everything: their homes, their savings, and their relationships, just to keep the flame of truth alive. They were the frontline soldiers in a word war that has lasted over 100 years. Their legacy is the very information that the modern man now takes for granted. They proved that while you can bury a story, you cannot kill the truth if there is even one person willing to print it. We have seen the surveillance, the financial traps, the linguistic erasure, and the editorial gatekeeping. We have seen the rebellion and the rise of the digital counterculture. We have reached the final chapter of this deep dive. There is only one thing left to discuss: the future. What happens next? In a world of total transparency, AI-driven litigation, and a collapsing social contract, where does the American man go from here? In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to synthesize everything we have learned. We are going to look at the emerging trends of 2026 and beyond. We will explore the concept of the post-divorce man, and how the lessons of history are being used to build a new, more resilient identity. We are going to look at the final data points on the evolution of the American family, and give you the perspective you need to see the road ahead. The history has been written, but the future is still being negotiated. The final word is yours. As we stand in the year 2026, the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of divorce journalism has brought the American man to a unique historical crossroads. To understand the gravity of this moment, imagine a man named Nicholas. Nicholas is a 35-year-old software architect living in suburban Virginia. He is tech-savvy, informed, and currently navigating a dissolution of marriage. Unlike Henry in 1910 or Robert in 1985, Nicholas does not rely on the morning newspaper to tell him his worth or his legal standing. He is the first generation to live in the era of the post-media divorce. In this landscape, the historical trends we have tracked, the moral shaming, the financial entrapment, and the digital surveillance, have fused into a new reality where the man is no longer a passive subject of the narrative, but a deliberate architect of his own outcome. The data for 2026 indicates a fascinating shift in the potential outcomes for men who have studied the history of the system. We are seeing the rise of the preventive divorce strategy. Journalism in the early 2020s began to heavily cover the concept of the sunset clause in prenuptial agreements and the use of lifestyle clauses. These are not just legal tools. They are the result of decades of reporting on the financial devastation faced by previous generations. Nicholas, for instance, didn't enter his marriage with the blind optimism of the 1950s. He entered it with a historical perspective provided by the very independent media we discussed in the previous chapter. This shift from reactive to proactive is the most significant change in the American male psyche regarding domestic law in a century. Step by step, the journalism of 2026 has begun to move toward a more analytical, almost cold-blooded, look at the marriage contract itself. Financial journals are now treating marriage as a high-stakes partnership with a 40 to 50% failure rate, and they are reporting on it with the same rigor they apply to corporate mergers. Case studies of successful modern divorces emphasize the decoupling of emotion from the legal process. The media narrative is shifting from the tragedy of the broken home to the efficiency of the restructured family. For men like Nicholas, this means the historical weight of shame is being replaced by a pragmatic focus on asset protection and parenting time. However, the future is not without its high-tech hazards. Investigative journalism in 2026 is currently obsessed with the role of artificial intelligence in family court. We are seeing reports on AI judges, algorithms that process thousands of pages of financial and behavioral data to suggest custody arrangements and support amounts. The historical trend of the human judge with personal biases is being replaced by the algorithmic judge with systemic biases. Reporters are finding that these AI systems often rely on historical data that is rooted in the very 1990s and 2000s biases we have spent this masterclass uncovering. If the machine is trained on 30 years of deadbeat dad headlines, the potential outcomes for the modern man may still be skewed by the ghosts of old journalism. Imagine if Nicholas's legal fate was being decided by a program that viewed his career success as an inherent liability for custody, simply because the historical training data suggested that high-earning men spend less time with their children. This is the new frontier of the word war. It is a battle for the data. Journalists are now reporting on the importance of data hygiene for men in the years leading up to a potential split. Every fitness tracker log, every grocery delivery receipt, and every digital interaction is now a potential data point in an AI-driven litigation. The journalism of the future is essentially a guide to navigating the quantified self in a legal context. The social landscape is also being rewritten by a phenomenon that the media calls the Great Bachelorhood. Historical trends show a declining marriage rate among American men, particularly in the wake of the pandemic and the subsequent economic shifts. Journalism in 2026 is exploring why men are increasingly choosing to opt out of the traditional marriage contract altogether. The reporting suggests that the historical record of the divorce system has become a powerful deterrent. Case studies of the MGTOW or men going their own way movement, which were once relegated to the fringes of the underground press, are now being analyzed by mainstream sociological journals as a major demographic shift. This is the ultimate feedback loop. The history of how the system treated men in the past is directly influencing the formation of families in the present. But for those who do choose the path of the family, the future of fatherhood looks different than it did in the 1800s. We are seeing a move toward the village model, supported by a new type of journalism that celebrates the co-parenting man. The historical erasure of the nurturing father is being countered by a massive wave of content, from viral videos to long-form documentaries, that showcases the day-to-day reality of the involved divorced dad. This is not just a trend, it is a fundamental shift in the American cultural identity. The data shows that the more the media portrays men as essential parents, the more the courts are forced to move toward a presumption of 50-50 custody. The narrative has finally begun to serve the father as much as it once scrutinized him. As we conclude this deep dive, we must look at the legacy of the American man in journalism through a lens of resilience. From the man who posted his notice in the 1850 Gazette to Nicholas navigating his AI-assisted mediation in 2026, the journey has been one of constant adaptation. The system was designed to be a gauntlet, but the history reveals that men have consistently found ways to innovate, organize, and survive. The potential outcomes today are vastly different because of the men who were willing to be the villains in the headlines of the past, so that the men of the future could be the heroes of their own stories. The evolution of the American family is not a story of decline, but of transformation. We have moved from the rigid, fault-based morality of the Victorian era to the complex, data-driven transparency of the digital age. The media has been a weapon, a shield, and a mirror. By understanding how the ink of the past has shaped the laws of the present, you gain the power to write your own final chapter. The gatekeepers have lost their monopoly, the surveillance is visible, and the language is yours to reclaim. What does the road ahead look like for the American man? It is a road defined by the rejection of the disposable identity, It is a road where fatherhood is non-negotiable and financial sovereignty is a baseline requirement. The historical archives are closed on the era of the silent sufferer. We are now in the era of the informed litigant. The history of U.S. journalism has provided us with a map of the minefield. It is up to the individual to navigate it with the wisdom of the past and the technology of the future. This journey through the decades has shown us that while the ink may change, the fundamental struggle for equity, respect, and presence remains. The story of divorce for men is a story of the American spirit itself, constantly under pressure, frequently misrepresented, but ultimately unbreakable. As you look toward your own future, remember that you are part of a long lineage of men who refuse to be erased by a headline. But even as we reach the end of this historical overview, a new question arises that will define the next decade of American life. It is a question that goes beyond the law and into the very heart of the social contract. It involves the rise of the gray divorce and the specific challenges of men who find themselves starting over after 30 years of marriage. What happens when the historical trends of the 20th century collide with the longevity of the 21st? In the next series, we will investigate the senior divorce crisis and the hidden reality of the aging American father. We will look at the loss of social networks, the specific financial risks of late-life splits, and how the media is currently ignoring the fastest-growing demographic in family court. The story is never truly over. It just finds a new generation to test. The final word may be yours, but the next chapter is already being written in the archives of tomorrow. Stay informed, stay resilient, and never let the narrative define your worth.